Sound check. Check one, check two.
Hello, Elizabeth. Thank you for joining me for today's conversation.
Hi, Dan. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
It's been a couple of years, hasn't it, since we were last on together? And
That's right.
I so enjoyed our first conversation, because this is the second time you've been on, and that I ever since that moment wanted to get you back on, and not only to see what is still to this point, still to this date, the best Zoom background. No, no one demand.
Thank you.
It's fantastic. I didn't get you back on just to see the Zoom background, but it is pretty good.
It's a perk.
It's it's a just so people who have not had the opportunity to listen to you speak before, haven't maybe seen the show that we did last time together. I wonder if you can just quickly tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we're going to dive into today's topic.
Sure. I am a university professor at the Auburn University in Alabama in the Southeast United States. And I've been there for about 9 years now. And I also own my own private studio, Benson Music Studios, and it specializes in musical theater and anything non-classical, essentially musical theater, pop rock. And where I live, I'm one of the few people who does that in my town. And so it's a really great way for me to interact with my community. And I really love my work. And for the last several years, I've been doing a lot of writing and publishing on issues of social justice and their intersection, particularly with voice pedagogy and in studio settings where we have one-to-one training. So the article that I've just written with my fabulous co-author, Kate Rosen, is Anti-Fat Bias in the Singing Voice Studio. And part 1 came in March and part 2 just dropped last week, and that's in the Journal of Singing. Oh, he's got it. Wonderful.
There it is.
A plus.
And I have read both articles in detail, and can I tell you that I found it a challenging read. I think we all come to this topic with a level of lived experience, perhaps. I know, for example, I have family members who have struggled with weight for many years. And so this is, and again, I just want to say this as we get into this conversation, this is going to be a topic, I think, for some people that might be rather triggering. And we are, I make this commitment to you, Elizabeth, and to my community. We're going to really approach this with a great sense of sensitivity, and with a sense of humble curiosity, because you've got a lot of really important things that you make mention of in the articles, and just sort of to dive into the topic. That's the title is probably first and foremost quite confronting. Here in Australia, the term fat, and I want to talk about terminology to start with. The term fat, and I ran this past my sister, who is a nutritionist, and she arced up at the use of the term fat, because here in Australia, it is a rather loaded term. The term fat itself here in Australia has a lot of stigma attached to it. But you argue, along with your co-author Kate, you argue for this approach to reclaiming the word fat, and in fact recognizing words like obese and overweight as being stigmatized. Can you use that as an opportunity? Can we talk about that first? Because we're going to be using the term fat a lot in today's conversation, aren't we?
Yes, absolutely. Yes. And I think it's really important to say that my co-author Kate Rosen is a fat liberationist voice teacher. That's how she identifies, and she's a person who's lived in a large body most of her life, and it was really essential to partner with someone with a lived experience, who's come up as a singer and gone through training programs and tried to work as a professional while doing so in a large body. So we're coming at this not as outsiders, but as a pair of people who've been impacted, me to a much lesser extent than Kate, but I myself have a personal journey too that has to do with perimenopausal hormone changes, my body changing, and my doctors being just totally clueless and having no ability to help me. And I sort of came to an awakening through my own experience there that maybe what I had been taught my whole life to believe and think about fatness might not actually be true. So I think that we need to, I just want to qualify that to say that we're not looking at this as outsiders, but as a representation of a real lived experience. And there's a lot of pain that goes along with that. And I think that's really important to say out loud. So just starting with the terminology, you're absolutely right. The word fat was even difficult for me when I first started this work with Kate to really use it comfortably and to sort of be confident that it wasn't going to strike fear in the hearts of anybody who heard the word, but that I could sort of like take it on as almost like a badge of honor. And it's the reclaiming of a neutral word. If you don't have a word to describe a state of being, then you cannot build community. You cannot have solidarity, and you can't find friends who have similar experiences. You cannot sort of even talk about it in a way that is truly liberating or that brings about equity. And so we can't even say, like there's certain states here in the United States now where you're not even allowed to say the word gay. And so it's the same. Like if we just took away that word and said, you can no longer use that word because it's offensive. Well, what would we say? Then we'd have to come up with all sorts of euphemisms and coded language, but that's all done underneath this umbrella of, well, you're not allowed to use the real word. And who's the arbiter of the words we're allowed to use? I think especially, if you are a member of the fat community, you get to decide what you're to be called and what words work for you and what words don't work for you. So obese and overweight, and I use quotes when I use those words, have been used to pathologize fatness and to make it like a health-related medical issue when it isn't always and isn't necessarily. And as voice teachers, that's not within our purview anyway. We are not medical experts. We are not nutritionists or personal trainers, unless that is something that we've pursued separately. But for the most part, your average voice teacher is there to talk about singing, not to dispense medical advice on someone's body size. And so it's really important, I think, to go at this with an understanding that fat is a neutral adjective. In the way that we're using it, there is no judgment attached to it. There is no shame attached to it. And what we're trying to do is eliminate the stigma by just using the word. And I think it's similar to kind of, the Voldemort in the Harry Potter series, right? If you just say his name, he holds a lot less power.
It's interesting.
So
that was the example that I had come to mind as you were talking about it. He who shall not be named. Yes, right. I think is the quote.
Right.
I think one of the reasons why, and I want to be, one of the reasons why because when I reached out to you a few weeks ago and said, hey, do you want to come on the show again? I said, what's your hot topic? And you said, well, this is what I'm doing currently. And I went, ooh, that is a hot topic. But I don't want to shy away from what I go on and on here at Voice Essentials about authenticity. And part of authenticity, you've got to be brave to be authentic, yes? And so we are, as a community, I think, being a bit brave today. I know I'm being a bit brave in talking about this topic. And part of that authenticity, what I want to share and it was really the first, because your article, there's two articles, part 1 and part 2. And part 1 you really drive at stigma and implicit bias.
Yes.
And I think therein lies, perhaps for me, some of the uncomfortability in recognizing, wow, I've been holding some bias, some stigma unrecognized, certainly not intentional. And I am, quietly happy to report that I had already done a number of things in my teaching space to accommodate fat people, larger people, but and so I was conscious of it, but still I have used language like, it's not over until the fat lady sings. I mean, that's probably the most classic example we can give of this unstated, implicit bias that we hold. How do we move forward in a really proactive way when we recognize those stigmas within ourselves?
Sure. Well, implicit bias, I think it's really important to say it's no one's fault. If you have an implicit bias, it's part of your culture. It's part of absorbing the information that's available to you from the trusted sources where you get your information. And I was raised to trust doctors and believe doctors when they give us information. And so it's certainly not my fault that I was raised with an anti-fat bias. I believe in the United States, the entire culture is very fat phobic and very anti-fat. And that has a lot to do with representation on stages and in films and television, and also in fashion magazines, and the power of the fashion industry and everything, celebrity culture. There's so many competing values here that have a lot to do with appearance, and your appearance has to fall into a very narrow set of standards that make up the quote beauty standard. And it's been very clear that people in larger bodies are not welcome in that space. And so I think that it's, like I said, it's no one's fault if that's what you grew up with. It's what you saw, it's what you consumed, it's the water we swim in, it's in the air we breathe. But once you become aware of it, it's incredible to see how widespread it is, and I've even got to the point now where, like, there's certain television shows I can't watch, or things, especially like The Simpsons is a good example of a television show that I grew up with. And Simpsons is a little bit edgy, but like it really has some like offensive fat phobic content in it that I can't tolerate. And I think that is that exists everywhere now. And so there's certain movies and topics and things I'm just like, I can't even do that, because it just brings up too many things that make me upset. But I think that that whole idea with implicit bias is that you have to look within. And so holding an implicit bias is certainly not your fault. Continuing to hold the bias once you become aware of the damage that it can do, there is some culpability in that. So our hope with this article was simply to, especially with the first part, to really provide a lot of culture and context and information that people might not be aware of, so that they could look to start to deconstruct their own implicit bias, or to even confront it, to even realize that it's there, and realize what hold it has over your thoughts and assumptions and your ability to show up for your students. Because we don't always choose our students based on body size. In fact, we never do. So you're going to get whoever you get in your studio, and it's really important that you have tools to speak with them in a way that doesn't cause them further harm or damage. And so you have to be aware of how fat folks are treated in the larger world, and the sort of systemic mistreatments that go on, the lack of laws to protect fat discrimination, to protect against fat discrimination, medical mistreatment, the diet industry, the $200 billion diet industry, and the power it holds over medical research that is done. And so I think that sort of if you start to look at all of those things, you're sort of confronted with an idea of like, hey, fatness might not always be the fault of the person in the large body. And that is a huge part of my own implicit bias I know that I grew up with. And so once I get away from that assumption that it's always within someone's control how big or how small their body is, then I can start to show up as a teacher who just meets the student where they are. And I don't try to encourage them in any way, shape, or form through my thoughts, actions, or anything I might say or even think, that I'm not going to further harm the student or cause them to feel shame about something they may or may not have any control over. It's actually none of my business whether or not they have control over it, because again, I'm not a medical doctor. And so I can't prescribing fitness is outside my scope of practice. Even asking someone about their body size is outside my scope of practice. Like, I'm there to talk about singing. And I don't know, I've never thought of a way that how big or how small someone's body is actually directly relevant to voice pedagogy. So it like the presence or lack of adipose tissue in your mid-range, in your middle of your body, how does that actually impact the function of your singing voice? I don't have an answer for that. I don't know that it does.
Is it, and I'm almost certainly speaking out of my implicit bias now. I wonder whether there is and I can only wonder as a cisgender white middle class male, middle-aged at that, I wonder if there's a change in our kinaesthesia. I don't know. I mean, what I do know is that every human being experiences their voice physically differently. That is not driven by how... I don't think we can necessarily codify, thin, medium, fat, as to that. But I think as singing teachers, I certainly approach my practice to always place the onus back on the student to say, what are you experiencing? It's not for me to impose upon the student to say, this is what you should be feeling. I can't do that. I think
you're absolutely right about that.
I think once upon a time we thought we could, but we don't.
Yes.
We don't do that anymore. Just like I don't touch. There was one thing that I was quite pleased in the second article to read, and that is I don't touch students out of practice. I haven't touched students since I started teaching. Do you know the reason why has got nothing to do with today's topic? It's got to do with the fact that I'm male, and I'm often in a studio with a female, and it's just to impose myself on someone else's body by touching it. I've just always been a hands-off teacher. So
I'm the same way. Yeah.
I think it was really interesting to me to learn that this is a really important part of teaching when it comes to fat people. I'm still struggling to actually say that. It's hard.
I know. It gets easier though. I promise. Yes.
Oh dear.
Yes. No, I'm also not a touching teacher. I never have been. And that's because I was touched as a student and I hated it.
Yeah, okay.
And I trusted my teachers. Of course, I was never touched inappropriately or under any circumstances that would make me feel icky.
Yeah.
But I just didn't want my body touched.
Yeah.
I just didn't want that.
Yeah.
And I didn't feel that I could assert that. I felt like if I had said, please don't touch me, or I don't want to be touched, that it would have had major negative consequences for me, either a bad grade or disapproval or blacklisting or, she's difficult to work with.
Yeah.
And so because I was so skin crawlingly uncomfortable with being touched as a student, I've never, ever touched my students. But through our research in this article, what we found is actually that, people in large bodies are often pushing their bodies beyond what is comfortable anyway on any given day. It's difficult to find a chair without armrests that you can sit in at the doctor's office. And so, there's just day-to-day things where their bodies are made to feel unwelcome. And so with a person in a large body, it would be nice if their voice lesson wasn't yet another place where they are struggling and pushing their bodies beyond comfortable limits. And that's the main reason that we talked about eliminating pedagogic touching. But our other recommendation was because we found in psychology literature that folks who've experienced trauma, and that can be any kind of trauma, it can be activated or triggered by touch, even if they get consent, even if the teacher gets consent. And everybody's big on that now. Well, I'm going to ask for consent.
Yes.
Well, enthusiastic consent can only be given in an equal power dynamic.
Yeah,
and a teacher-student dynamic does not have equal power.
And balance. Yeah.
Exactly. And so that is where, and even if they were to consent, that it can still be triggering. It can
Yes.
still trigger them.
Yes.
And I, as a teacher, never want to unintentionally bring up trauma for a student of mine. That's, of course, way beyond my scope of practice. It's also just mean. Like, I want to love my students. I don't want to hurt them. And
Yes.
so, like, that's just something I don't want to do for any reason. And
Yeah.
that's the main reason why we said you just need to retire it entirely. That is what we're saying. And we understand that's a pretty audacious point of view, and there are those who vehemently disagree with us, and that's fine. They're welcome to disagree, but we're just presenting the information so that people can be fully informed about what it means to touch a student and what the implications could possibly be, what the consequences of that insistence that that's the only way you can teach a certain concept, or that that consent is really a little bit more nuanced than a simple yes or no.
Yeah.
That you really have to look at all the dynamics involved there.
It's so interesting to, as I've been reading your article, and I couldn't read both articles one after the other. I needed time to process the first one.
Right.
Because it is, I found it challenging. I humbly present that fact. It was challenging, not because when I got to Article 2, I was quite reassured that there's so many things I have actively done in my teaching studio, intentionally to make people of all sizes more comfortable. But it's so. I was listening to the radio this morning, and they were talking about disability access within public spaces, and the lady was talking about how consultation with the disabled community, the disability community, is so important, because what able-bodied people might think is going to work for a disabled person, in practice, as well-intentioned as it was, in practice doesn't work, certainly doesn't work in the manner intended.
Right.
And I couldn't help but hear that conversation and reflect that upon the fat community. Gee, I'm struggling with it.
You're doing great. You're doing great.
So, and for those of you who are watching, I want you to know that we're being brave here today, and so it's I just couldn't help but think that we have to create a space for people who are fat to have a voice in being able to communicate what they need. It's almost like it's not just, okay, well, we now need to put in a larger chair and we need to remove a mirror. But, and this, I think, goes across the board, right? We must create a space that allows people to communicate what they need, not what we think they need.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that one of the things that I think has prevented that from happening, and why sort of anti-fat bias is so pervasive and I think still very widely tolerated, even though it's completely unacceptable from a social justice perspective, is that, there is still this misinformation piece that's in a lot of our minds that I know I was raised with, that says being fat is your fault. It is the fault of the person in the fat body that their body is fat. And so that's, I think, the single most dangerous idea. And if we can remove that idea and say, here is this person, this is their body, how can we make them comfortable in this space? That's really what we're after here. But I think that also, there has to be agency for those of us with thin privilege. We have to have some culpability in terms of thinking through spaces and making them accessible for all bodies. And it's one of those things where, I lived for a lot of my life with a lot of thin privilege, and I just never thought about so many things that impact a person living in a large body on a daily basis. And I took a lot of things for granted. And so that's my thin privilege. And that privilege really left me blind to a lot of the pain and the suffering that was going on. And then when you compound that with stigma and blame and shame around body size, like you should, a lot of the negative talk, I don't need to say any of it out loud here because we all know what it is, but the diet industry, the medical industry, everybody telling you that it's your fault, you don't want to speak up to advocate for yourself because you're just going to be told, if you would just become thin like everybody else, then the world would be your oyster. Everything's made for thin people. So the problem here is not that the world should change, it's that you should change. And that's what we are fundamentally arguing against in this article. We're saying that our largest argument here is that it's not the bodies that need to change, it's the industry that needs to make space on stages and in film and television. We have to tell stories of the world by representing the world as it actually is, not just filling those spaces with thin people. And it's just not an accurate representation of the world.
Yeah, I think we here in Australia, and we're seeing this in little steps. Not, we suddenly don't have a diverse representation on screen, but here in Australia, I think we're starting to see what would be in the fashion industry referred to as plus sizes,
right?
Represented a little bit more. I think they're all still very beautiful people, though, and that's probably the part where I think the representation on screen doesn't just need to be about size, it needs to be about diversity of look as well, doesn't it? It's just to the point of fault, because it's interesting, in our industry of singing teaching, there's been a really strong drive towards removing the sense of fault around voice damage. And the fact that for so long I was raised as a singing teacher to immediately place blame on the singer. If their voice falls into disrepair, it's got to have been the singer's fault for a lack of technique. That was just the stock standard, Of course, we now know that is not the case, but I do want to put in a little caveat there. That is not always the case. In fact, it's more often than not the case, but sometimes, of course, it is. Some people do knowingly use their voice in a manner that is going to possibly end in disrepair. But of course, then what I'm then given to doing is wanting to go even further back into that person's upbringing and why, and understand what programmed them to be to be not risk averse in those ways. And as I processed, I've done a lot of processing about this over the last few weeks. Elizabeth, you've really thrown me a curveball on this discussion. I don't think there is another conversation I've ever had on this show that has caused me to think so deeply, self-reflective wise. When I think about fault around, I don't think about fault as someone being fat, as being their fault. However, there can be behaviors that can lead to an increase in weight in a person, isn't there?
Yes, that's one of many components.
Yes. I'm certainly not saying that it's everything by any stretch. Yeah. Because there are people that are going to be watching this and they're going to immediately, as I think I did, they immediately want to go to the medical. They immediately want to go to behaviors like eating and what have you. The boomers, they from my upbringing, we grew up eating everything that had been deep fried, and it wasn't healthy. That's not healthy way to, you know, to cook your food, and it has implications for your health, not simply your weight, but for other things as well.
Right, cardiovascular health and a lot of other
absolutely.
factors. Yeah, the big difference between what you're talking about when it comes to voice injury and inefficient behaviors that could lead to injury and fatness is that voice injury or vocal behaviors or vocal function that has potential negative outcomes, that's absolutely in a voice teacher's scope of practice. That's our bread and butter. That's exactly what we are here to teach and to talk about. That's what we're knowledgeable about. That's where our training is. When it comes to the myriad of factors that influence how large or small someone's body is, almost none of that is in a voice teacher's scope of practice. That gets into the medical, the nutrition, the fitness, all of those other things, also genetics, also health conditions that we may or may not be aware of because we don't ask our students to disclose medical information because it's private.
Yeah.
And so it's a different story when someone shares with you, if they have a history of eating disorder, for example.
Yes.
But if you have a student in your studio with an eating disorder, you might not know. You might not know that that's what they're dealing with. You might not know. And so if you say something about someone's weight, that can activate people who are in the middle of dealing with a horrible chronic illness that they're struggling with.
Yeah.
And so I think that's where, like, I see that a little bit as a false equivalency. I'm going to push back on that a little bit because voice behaviors are absolutely in a voice teacher's scope of practice.
Yeah.
The size of someone's body is not.
Yeah. 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 No, I certainly wasn't suggesting that it was. I was just thinking about the relevancy, I guess, of not relevancy is probably not the right word. And I hope you can see how I'm trying to process this in a way that is appropriate.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, I do. And I really appreciate it, Dan. And I want to take a moment to thank you for sitting in how uncomfortable this is with me and having this conversation. It's a brave act and it's a radical act of allyship. Anytime we provide a platform to talk about a marginalized group of people.
Yes.
And so I really am thankful for it. And I'm glad that you're here. And I know that it's uncomfortable. And I thank all the listeners as well for sitting with us in this uncomfortable space so that we can try to make the world better. So we can try to, raise our voice students to change the world and make all art better.
Yes. And I think that's the key, right? We have a saying here in Voice Essentials that every voice deserves to be heard. And those voices are contained within a diverse group of human beings. No human being having the same story as the next. And it doesn't matter what the casing is for those voices, whether they be of a particular color, whether they be of a particular size, whether they be of a particular gender orientation. It's actually irrelevant to the fact that every individual deserves to have their voice heard. And in singing, that comes through the expression of singing. And we're all for that. And I'm purposefully asking some of these questions that I think I'm coming to a reconciliation within myself, a resolve. But I'm asking some of these uncomfortable questions because I know that they are the questions that will arise because they rose up in me, and I wanted to give you that opportunity to respond to some of these difficult points. These are not easy because, and this comes back to this particular topic is so undiscussed. Like that's probably the thing that I did walk away going, wow, we really don't. I was watching Seinfeld the other night, and like it's I have to say it's one of my favorite sitcoms, but it's got some really implicit fat bias in it, hasn't it? Mm-hmm.
Yes.
It's threaded throughout our society. What I guess on one level where there's some microactivism to go on here, isn't there? There's some, what do you think are the key? Because I'm looking down at the time and going, oh my goodness, we're nearly out of time. What are some key things, not just for singing teachers, and there will be singing teachers watching this, but a lot of people that watch this show are not singing teachers. They're singers. They're human beings existing within their society and their community. What are some things, give us all three takeaway key points that we can actively start to do today that can be supportive of, this, you've used the term fat liberationist framework.
Yes. Yeah. And so let me define that quickly. A fat liberationist framework holds that all people are entitled to equal treatment and dignity under the law and within our culture. So we have currently not reached that state here in the United States. There are no federal laws that protect people from employment discrimination or education discrimination or housing discrimination based on body size. It's perfectly legal to just fire someone for being fat. And that, I think, is incredible. It's incredible to me that that's still the case. There are a couple of states, Washington State and Michigan State, that do have anti-discrimination laws that include fat people, but everywhere else it's perfectly legal. And so that's a big problem. We're not anywhere close to what it needs to be. But I think in terms of our takeaways, I think one of the most important things is to rehumanize fat people. That as a bystander, as an acquaintance or someone passing by, or as a teacher with a student in your studio, that body is not yours to judge. That belongs to someone else. And you are not aware of all of the factors that may have contributed to where they are now. They may be the healthiest that they have ever been in their entire lives because they've struggled with an eating disorder. And this is the healthiest they are appearing to you today. And you might not have any ability to see that or know that. And so it's really essential to affirm the way that your students are in front of you every day, and not to encourage them to be different to somehow fit in to the industry standards or beauty standards or what's getting cast or what's hireable or, I've heard stories of people like being told either gain 20 pounds or lose 20 pounds, but where you are right now is unacceptable. Anything like that is so toxic and so incredibly potentially damaging to the person being told that. So I think just acknowledging your students, affirming the way they are today as absolutely perfect, no matter what state they are in, and working with them from that point. And then certainly as voice teachers, I want to be really clear, some of the pushback that we've had on this article is sort of a criticism of fat positivity, just sort of the audacity of saying, hey, fat people deserve dignity and respect and protection, just like everyone else in the world. That is a really hard message for some people to hear. But we're not saying it as medical doctors. We're not changing the diet industry, much as I personally might like to. We don't have that kind of power. We're just here to talk about voice teachers and what voice teachers can do to create a safe learning space for their students and to affirm all of their students and to be truly inclusive. Because if you are on that social justice train and you truly believe that all people deserve dignity and equity and affirmation and a sense of belonging in your studio, in your community that you create in your studio, then that means all people. It doesn't mean with an asterisk unless you're below a certain size. So I think that it's really, really important. That's, I think, at the foundation of what we're hoping will change in people's hearts and minds, is that as voice teachers, meeting your students where they are also includes accepting and affirming your student's body in whatever state it's in. So I don't know if that was 3, but I think that's my biggest one that I hope folks will walk away with.
I hope people do walk away with that today. My greatest hope is that people having watched our discussion today, at the very least, it challenges them to reflect on their own behaviors, their own thought processes. Implicit bias is challenging to confront simply because it's generally unknown to you until you're caused to or confronted with those thoughts, and it's an uncomfortable space. This is not easy, is it? It's, you know,
Right.
to really, and I am definitely of this nature. I don't like being uncomfortable. I'll give you an example. This morning we woke up and our tap was not operating in our kitchen. Something had gone wrong with it, blah blah. I got a guy out immediately this morning to fix it. Like, I don't like things to be out of place. I don't like things to be uncomfortable. I don't like things to sit unaddressed. But when we come to topics like this, and like I said, after reading the first part of your 2-part article, I had to sit with it. I had to have some conversations about it. I needed to reflect. And I want to really encourage everyone in our audience to do the same, to walk away. Don't immediately go right, wrong, or indifferent, or, you know, rally cry against, you know, this idea. I want to encourage everyone to really take a moment to think about what their orientation towards this is. We've got so many examples of very fun. I mean, Lizzo is probably the most prominent contemporary vocal example of a fat body singer that we all kind of know at the moment. And I can only think that there are so many, probably including me, who have been so quick to make like completely unqualified judgments on why she is the size that she is.
Yep.
But I think we need to take a step back, don't we, and really reflect on our own thought process and and even if it just comes down to thinking about the way you use language, you know, that's
Right.
you know.
And I think too, often we sort of code the language under the auspices of health. I'm concerned about your health, when actually you're concerned about someone's weight. And so a lot of people make the statement that, you know, Lizzo's so unhealthy. And anybody who says that, I would challenge them to try to sing one of her songs, play the flute, and do her dance break. And let's see how well you do at that level of athleticism. I know myself, I couldn't keep up with the way that she dances and sings on stage. It's insane.
Yeah.
So if we're using successful vocal production and like execution of amazing dance moves as a measure of how healthy someone is, she is really healthy. Okay. But it's also not for me to judge whether a person is healthy or not, because I don't know what they're eating. I don't know their fitness routine. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a medical doctor.
I guess the key point there is we don't think to apply the same judgment to thin people. And that's,
nope.
You know, and so that's where the bias is exposed, isn't it? We apply it to one person, but we don't apply it to another. Right there, that's the point of bias.
Right.
And because you're absolutely right there. And I see them at my gym. There are people at my gym who are fat people, but man, I can only dream of when I see what they're doing. I cannot keep up with that.
Right.
And so, we do have to
talk
bring
about that in the article too, the idea of uncoupling fitness and fatness.
Yeah.
That those like thin people can be very unfit.
Yes.
And fat people can be incredibly fit.
Absolutely.
And everything in between. And again, not our scope of practice.
Not
it's
our
not for
scope
us
of
to
practice.
say or
no.
judge as voice teachers.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah, there are a lot of things that are not in the scope of practice of a singing teacher that I think singing teachers inadvertently find themselves swimming in lanes that are not theirs. And this is just another one for us to be mindful of.
Well, it especially comes up with adjudication.
Yeah.
You know, when people might make maybe a well-intentioned comment, you think you're being helpful by telling it like it is. It can be devastating to a student. And so we have to think about not just just our intention, but our impact.
Yeah.
And so that's where I think being well informed about what it is like to exist in the world as a fat person is really important for a voice teacher. And if we want to really be empathetic and compassionate and kind to our students, we really need to know more. And that's why we wanted to put this information in this article. And I should say in part one, we didn't present anything new. We were not reinventing the wheel. This is not our own original research. We are just putting together what other people have already found. And we put it all in one nice location for you to consume. But from my friends who are already fat liberationist, what I've heard from them and reading the article is, yeah, nothing was new to me, but it was nice. It was all in one place, but I think for people who are encountering their information for the first time, like your experience was like, wow, I need to take some time to digest this and to just sit with it and process it and to really think. And that was actually like a serendipitous occurrence with the publication timeline, because we submitted an article that was just too long. It was twice as long as it was supposed to be. And we sent it to our associate editor and said, like, we know this is way too long. And he wrote back and I said, we know we have to cut the beginning. We're just going to cut a bunch of the stuff. And he was like, no, I don't want you to do that. This is Brian Manternak. He's like, no, I'm going to ask for special permission for a 2-part article, because he said you can't cut any of this. And so that, again, radical act of allyship, offering us a platform and amplifying our message. But I think that it ended up being great that people had that time to read the first part.
Yeah.
For folks for whom it was new information, they needed that time to process before we went in with, here's the solutions, and this is how to be active and participate in a way that's affirming and positive.
Can I really congratulate both of you on it? For me, the information, I'll declare, the information wasn't new, but the framing of the information was caused me to look at the information in a fresh way, and that's what I appreciated. And to the point where it caused me to really self-reflect, and I hope that you can't grow without some friction, right? Like, and so it's we're all about growing here at Voice Essentials, not just the singing, but as human beings, because at the end of the day, it's actually human beings that operate the voice. So we have to grow. We're out of time. We're way out of time. We do have to finish. I just want to thank you for coming on and so graciously talking about this subject with me and with my community. It's not an easy topic, and my great desire is that people that have been watching today's show have really picked up on the sensitivity with which we have really tried to approach the topic. I hope that's what we've been able to do. I want to just really make a point, though, that because YouTube can be a nasty place, any negative, any inappropriate commentary on this video will be immediately deleted. I won't even ask questions. I just going to throw that up there. Maybe I should have said that at the beginning of the video, but that is what's going to happen. This is a sensitive topic, and it's one that, we're going to continue to maintain a safe space for it to be discussed. So thanks for coming onto the show today to do that with me, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much, Dan. Thank you for having me, and thank you to all the listeners. Thank you so much for participating, and I wish you grace in your thinking on this topic.
Yeah, thank you. Well, there you go. And from what I could see over to the side with all the commentary, where is it, over this side? I think there's been a fair bit of grace extended in the live chat. So thank you to everyone that has been doing that. Wow, I'm gonna need some time after that discussion. I'm sure you will too. Take the time to think, sit with it, sit with the uncomfortability of it, if it is uncomfortable for you. If this is a topic that has raised significant issues for you personally, I encourage you to talk to a licensed healthcare professional about that. And I'm not just talking a general practitioner. I'm talking maybe a psychologist or even talk to a friend or family member who and generate some conversation about it, because this is a topic I think we're going to hear more and more about in the coming weeks, months and years, because it is important, right? It is important. Next week, we're going to do a Q&A where we're going to answer your questions. You might have a question about today, and maybe I'll be able to answer them. But generally, when we get together for the Q&A, we just have a good old chat and we answer your generalized singing questions. And we're going to do that next week. If you've enjoyed today's video, hit the thumbs up button. Also, if you want to be reminded when we go live, you can subscribe and hit the white bell icon. And that way you will get a reminder. We do these every Monday at 1 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time, and we will do our Q&A next week. Wow, that show's going to go down in Voice Essentials history. I am certain of it. I've really enjoyed today's show, challenging as though it was. I hope you have too. I hope you have a great week, and I very much look forward to seeing you again soon. I'm Dr. Dan. Sing well.